Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Stand Up for the Gulf Whale, taking conservation action to protect Rice's whales. We're really excited to have you all here this evening. We're really excited to spend some time with our featured presenter tonight, Dr. Francine Kershaw. But in the meantime, just going to do a few little introductions. I am Christian Wagley, and I work for Healthy Gulf. Healthy Gulf is a nonprofit organization that works across the Gulf of Mexico region from Florida to Texas on a variety of issues related to water, energy, climate, and endangered species. And indeed, tonight, we're going to be focused on one of the most endangered animals on the planet, the Rice's whale. So we're very excited to have you all here with us for this presentation. A little bit about how it's going to go this evening. Dr. Kershaw will present to us first. And then I'm going to give a very short perspective on some of the things happening here on the Gulf Coast related to the Rice's whales, including some of the current threats to the whales' recovery in the U.S. Congress, some of the legislation going on there. And then Dr. Kershaw will take your questions at the end. And we do ask that if you have questions that you go ahead and chat those, or excuse me, enter those into the chat. And you can do that at any time here, and we'll be monitoring the chat for those questions, and we'll compile those and ask those at the end. And if anybody's watching live on Facebook, you can do that there as well. You can chat put your question in the comments there, and we will be sure to get to those at the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and give a full introduction to Dr. Kershaw. Francine Kershaw is a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she uses the best available scientific information to advocate for improved protections for marine mammals related to a variety of issues, including ocean noise, bycatch, and vessel strikes. She's been working to protect Rice's whales from oil and gas development, vessel strikes, and other activities for several years, and also leads NRDC's work to end large whale entanglements, and works as part of a broader team to advance responsible offshore wind development. Francine holds a degree in zoology from the University of Leeds, a master's degree in biodiversity, conservation, and management from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Columbia University. She's currently based in Charleston, South Carolina. And the ability to have Dr. Kershaw join us tonight is really a good example of just the incredible importance of these partnerships that Healthy Gulf that we have with national partners like NRDC, because they have expertise that we don't have here. You know, Dr. Kershaw is a whale scientist. We have scientists on staff, but we don't have anybody specializing in whales. So we rely on people like Dr. Kershaw to help advise us. And what we do is provide that regional perspective, that voice of the Gulf Coast, what's happening here with the fishermen or the boating community, the shipping community, any of the affected communities down on the Gulf Coast. So it's a great partnership, and we work together, and we couldn't do it without NRDC. So with that, Dr. Kershaw, thank you so much for being here, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it really is a pleasure to be here with you all today to talk about why we need to stand up for the Gulf whale, and just to show my appreciation as well to you all on the line that's choosing to spend your evening with us to learn about this really neat whale in the Gulf. So thank you. So during this presentation, my goal is really to convince you that all Rice's whales have unique and amazing biology. They're also under serious threat, and most importantly, that they need our help. So let's start by diving into the biology. So it might seem incredible that we're all still working out which species is what for some whales, and it is still true in some cases. And the group of whales that Rice's whales are a part of, and known as Bruder's whales as the broader category, have a notoriously complicated taxonomy. And so for quite a long time, we were trying to figure out, is it a unique species? Is it part of, a closely related, species? But in 2021, there was a breakthrough, and scientists were able to bring together information in whale genetics, in morphology, and in acoustic behavior to confirm that Rice's whales are in fact a unique species. And a more recent study of genomics has shown that the Rice's whale lineage actually diverged 3 million years ago. And Dr. Matt Leslie, who leads this work, enjoys asking the question to us, where were humans 3 million years ago? And the answer being that we, of course, didn't exist yet. And in fact, the genus Homo from Homo sapien didn't exist either. So these whales have been around a really long time. So the photo at the bottom of the slide here shows, for the complicated terminology, but the vertex of the skulls of three other species of whales that they're compared to the Rice's whale skull. And the Rice's whale skull here is in the blue box, and the other three closely related species are to the left and to the right. Um, so it's a pretty hard game of spot the difference, but if you do look closely, you can see some small differences, several of which involves the whale's navel cavity, which is that kind of U-shaped hole at the top there. And this slide is just showing a little bit more detail on how they collect biopsy samples from whales for the genetic analysis, all of which is permitted by the government, which is really important for any interaction with a whale species, in particular an endangered whale. So you can see there in the top right, there's a small plug of skin and blubber that's collected by a biopsy dart that's shot usually by a crossbow or sometimes like a blow dart. From a small boat that would be close to the whale, and the scientists deploy that dart, and then they're able to collect this small plug of skin and blubber, and then they conserve that on the boat and take it to the lab. And then on the lower left there, the skull of the Rice's whale that you saw on the previous slide actually came from this animal that was stranded in 2019. And if the whale hadn't stranded and been examined in this way, we may still not have the morphological information we needed to define the new species. So having those resources ready to go in that moment were really important. And supporting evidence that right whales are a unique species is also provided by its distinctive call type. So there are many different types of technologies that we can deploy at sea to listen out for vocalizing whales. There's a nice little cartoon of some there that NOAA Fisheries has produced. And we can then analyze those recordings and characterize the types of sounds that whales produce using something called a spectrogram. And that's a visual representation of the spectrum of frequencies of a signal as it varies with time. And it essentially creates a pretty cool picture like those that you see on the right here. So that what you see in the spectrograms on the right are a visual representation of 5 different calls produced by Rice's whales. And the ones in the blue box have been studied and been found to be unique to that particular species. So if you hear one of those calls, you know it's a Rice's whale. And home really is where the Gulf is for Rice's whales, as they're the Gulf's only year-round resident whale species. So they're really special to the region. Most aerial and vessel-based sightings of the whale collected over the last almost 35 years now have been concentrated within and near the DeSoto Canyon in the northeastern Gulf. And actually that's just just south of the Panhandle there. You can see there's a shape that looks a little bit like a seahorse on the eastern side, and it's just about located in the seahorse's head. And we'll get back to what that seahorse is in a second. So that area, the seahorse area, is referred to as the core habitat. And that area has been the focus of most research and management effort. And in the figure, you can see the sightings, which are the white, black, and grey dots in there that were collected during the Southeast Fisheries Science Centre visual surveys during a pretty long period from 2009 to 2019. And then the track lines of the survey vessels are shown in blue. And those surveys also showed something pretty interesting, and that was that the whale's distribution is highly restricted to waters between 100 and 400 meters in depth. Excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry about that. But oh, excuse me, sorry. But our understanding of Rice's whale habitat use continues to evolve. In 2021, NOAA Fisheries completed a 5-year study of species habitat. And multiple lines of scientific evidence emerged from that study that strongly support the identification of habitat extending from the DeSoto Canyon across the northern Gulf of Mexico along the continental shelf break between the 100-meter and 400-meter isobats. including waters off Louisiana and Texas. So the persistent occurrence of Rice's whales in the northwestern Gulf of Mexico has been documented through the use of passive acoustics, with hydrophones placed at multiple survey sites along the shelf break. More than 1,200 days of acoustic data from the western and central areas of the Northern Gulf have been scientifically analyzed and published. Vocalizations were detected as frequently as 1 in every 6 days, sampled at the westernmost survey site that you can see here on the map. And nearly 2,000 Rice's whales calls were acoustically detected on the westernmost record overall. Rice's whales are therefore frequently relying on habitat in this region on a year-round basis. It's worth noting that higher levels of ambient noise in the Western Gulf are also likely to significantly reduce the range over which calls are detected. So the number of detected calls is likely an underestimate of habitat use in this region. The shelf break habitat identified through passive acoustic monitoring of the whales also matches the habitat features identified as essential to Rice's whale foraging. In another component of the 5-year study, researchers concluded that Rice's whales are selective predators focused on aggregations of certain high energy content fish, and primarily a schooling fish known as Arioma bondi. Both historical catch records and near-bottom trawling data show that Arioma bondi favor the same shelf break habitat throughout the northern Gulf of Mexico, where the whales have been shown to persistently occur. And this evidence is further complemented by the newly available habitat suitability analysis from NOAA that delineates the same shelf break waters across the northern Gulf as highly suitable habitat for the whale, based on oceanographic features such as water depth, bottom temperature, and primary productivity. And here on the map, so red is highly suitable predicted habitat, and blue is low suitability habitat. And you'll also notice that the habitat model predicts suitable habitat in the southern Gulf of Mexico. And just this year, a passive acoustic monitoring study confirmed that Rice's whales calls can be heard on hydrophones located in Mexican waters of the Gulf. In the figure on the left, you can see a hydrophone location labeled MR, which stands for Mexican Ridges. And this hydrophone corresponds to the bottom graph in the figure on the right, which shows the Rice's whales calls, represented by blue bars. They're pretty faint in that figure on the right there, but you can just kind of see them around the middle of the graph that are clustered between about April and November. So the Rice's whales were heard during multiple months during September 2020 to July 2022 during the sampling period. And so it was a long hypothesis of ours that the whales would not necessarily stop and turn around when they got to the political border, but now we know for sure that at least some animals are swimming through Mexican waters. Okay, now to dive into the threats to the whale. And I wanted to start by showing this really nice new graphic developed by NOAA and partners that underscores that this newly delineated species is also one of the most endangered in the world. There are most likely fewer than 100 individuals remaining, and the latest population estimate is, in fact, only approximates 50 individuals based on sightings and some population modeling. So a population size so low is not normal for any species. It means that the Rice's whale is highly vulnerable to impacts. And some other endangered marine mammals, such as the vaquita, once they got to this population size, they did experience a pretty rapid decline afterwards. So we're really on a clock to try and bolster the recovery of this species and protect them from additional threats. The fact that this species occupies such a relatively small habitat area also puts it at significant risk of catastrophic events such as oil spills. And although this isn't communicated in this graphic, we also know that several of the, approximately 50 whales that have been observed are in poor body condition, with likely implications for their health and longevity and ability to have calves. So the population is small, it's geographically restricted, and it's not necessarily very healthy at the moment. So I'm going to focus most of this section on two major threats to the species, oil and gas development and vessel strikes, and touch briefly on some other human pressures. And just to emphasize that there really is no room for error here, based on NOAA Fisheries' own analysis that considers population abundance, population growth rate, and the conservation status of the species, only one Rice's whale can be killed by human activities every 14 years if the species is ever to recover. So the loss of even a single whale, especially if it's a reproductive female, threatens the survival of the species. So oil and gas development in the Gulf represents a clear existential threat to the survival and recovery of Rice's whales. There's no better example of this than the impacts of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Almost half of the DeSoto Canyon habitat area was exposed to service oil, and NOAA estimated that the species suffered a 22% population decline as a direct result. Some Rice's whales were killed outright, and additional animals suffered reproductive failure and disease. So putting aside other human impacts, it was estimated it would take the species 69 years to recover from this single event. Rice's whales are also subject to chronic exposure to noise from seismic oil and gas exploration, which is what oil and gas companies use to search for deposits under the seabed. They use incredibly loud noise to map deep into the seabed, dominate the acoustic environment through much of the Northern Gulf. The seismic blasts are emitted every few seconds for days, weeks, and even months on end. And they're known to have far-reaching effects on baleen whales, not only Rice's whales, but other species as well, including the masking of biologically important sounds, and the disruption of activities vital to feeding and reproduction over large areas of the ocean. This is a particularly serious problem for a population like Rice's whales. Sorry, excuse me. Not only because their numbers are extremely small, but because some of the whales are, as I say, in poor body condition. An acoustic analysis, which you can see here on the slide, of seismic surveys in 2010 and 2021 show that airgun blasts were often present more than 50% of the time at the sites where they were detected. The noise generated by surveys was also found to spread broadly throughout the Gulf. And in some cases, noise from surveys taking place at the Western Gulf could be heard all the way across the basin in the northern easternmost recording sites. And deaths from collisions with vessels have been identified as one of the top threats to large whale populations globally, with vessels significantly more likely to cause the death of a whale when traveling at speeds above 10 knots. Evidence from TAG shows that Rice's whales spend 85 to 88% of the time at night when they're largely resting at the surface, which is about 70% of the time overall, leaving them highly vulnerable to vessel strikes. Mothers and calves of a number of large whale species are also observed to spend relatively more time at shallower depths. Two Rice's whales have shown direct evidence of vessel strike. In 2009, an adult lactating female was found stranded in Tampa Bay, Florida, with injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. It can be assumed that the whale's calf was not able to survive the death of its mother. In 2019, a free-swimming whale since named Lucky was observed in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico with a severely deformed spine, posterior to the dorsal fin and consistent with a vessel strike. Even when healed, injuries from vessel strikes can result in mortality at a later date. So even though this whale survived, it could be still subsequently die of its injuries. So the two cases of Rice's whale mortality and injury need to be considered along the fact that the majority of vessel strikes may go undetected, particularly in a region with limited monitoring effort. When unobserved deaths are accounted for, mortality of Rice's whales from vessel strikes alone is highly likely to exceed the established limit of one whale every 14 years. The northern Gulf of Mexico experiences considerable vessel traffic, particularly in the north, central, and western regions, where oil and gas exploration and development are concentrated. NOAA Fisheries calculated vessel strike risk for the whale in 2020, and this analysis was recently updated following the same methods but incorporating new density estimates for the whale. The updated analysis found that almost 90% of vessel strike risk to the whale occurred outside of the DeSoto Canyon core area, and that the risk posed by oil and gas industry vessels contributed almost 40% of all strike risk, and 32% of the risk posed by vessels traveling at speeds greater than 10 knots. So these findings run counter to messages that we've been hearing from the oil and gas industry recently that they represent only a minimal part of the problem. Clearly, it's quite significant. And cumulative impacts occur when an individual animal or population is repeatedly exposed to the same or different stressors. Even if not directly causing injury or mortality, being impacted by a multitude of stresses can erode the health and fitness of individuals, as well as the overall recovery potential of the species. One tragic example of direct harm from pollution is that of this 38-foot bale Rice's whale named Witch Hazel, who washed up along Sandy Key in the Florida Everglades in 2019. During Witch Hazel's examination, biologists noticed that he was underweight and had a hard piece of plastic approximately 3 inches by 2 inches in size in his stomach, which is believed to have contributed to his death. But not to depress you too much, hopefully that is still hope. Rice's whales can recover. They continue to produce calves, and our experience with other baleen whales shows that populations can rebound as conditions improve. So there are examples including eastern North Pacific gray whales, humpback whales that breed off the coast of Brazil, and the fin whale population that feeds off the Antarctic Peninsula. All of these populations and stocks have been dramatically reduced through whaling, but have shown a really impressive bounce backs if they're protected from the most significant threats. There are also immediate actions that we can take to meaningfully reduce risk to Rice's whales now and in the longer term. And it's important to note that monitoring each individual whale isn't possible. We can't know where they all are at any given time. And so we need to kind of rely on these more precautionary approaches based on proven risk reduction measures. So, we should desist from further oil and gas leasing and wind down oil and gas development in the Gulf, which we should be, doing anyway, for broader, reasons. We can require large commercial ships to travel at 10 knots or less through the whale's habitat, which is a proven method of reducing strike risk. And slowing vessels down also helps reduce levels of vessel noise, which benefits the whale and the broader marine ecosystem. And we can also avoid citing emerging industries in Rice's whale habitat. So we can require that strong protections are put in place where potential interactions are unavoidable, And BOEM did this successfully last year. BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and they're responsible for leasing offshore energy off the US coast in federal waters. And so they made a good conservation protective decision last year when they identified potential areas for offshore wind leasing in the Gulf, and they cited all of those areas outside of Gulf of Whale habitat, which is something that the NGO and Rice's Whale community pushed for, and we were pleased with the agency's decision. So now I want to explain why Rice's Whale. I mean, I've explained why Rice's Whales need our help right now, but I want to dig a little more into some of the ways in which the growing community of Gulf whale supporters are working to protect the whale. You'll see it really is taking a village, and we hope that you'll be inspired to join this effort. And I'm going to start with a higher level overview, and then I'll hand it back to Christian to speak about actions happening on the ground in the Gulf region. So there's no need to read this entire slide, but I wanted to show this list of conservation actions related to conservation actions, I would say policy decisions related to Rice's whales that have been going on for about the past decade now. Please note this list isn't intended to be comprehensive, but it's fairly representative. And I think demonstrates well the push-pull between efforts to protect the whale and also efforts to advance industry interests. And you'll see how things started to hot up a little bit from 2020 on as the scientific case for the species delineation, the listing of the species under the Endangered Species Act happened in 2019. And so there were more federal protections and federal kind of mechanisms to protect the whale. And this has resulted in, more engagement by different kind of stakeholders and parties with interest in this process. And there's been some good conservation things that have happened, like the listing, and then there's also been some losses as well as industry has clawed back some requirements that they had to protect the whale. We lost some of those recently, and so on. So it's definitely still a very live landscape. So one important development is that NOAA issued a proposed rule to designate critical habitat for the species in July 2023. And you can see from the map of the proposed area that NOAA incorporated the latest science on habitat use in the Western and the Central Gulf, which is good. And public comments on the proposed rule closed in September last year, and we're currently waiting for the final rule to be issued. However, the distribution of the critical habitat through the Western Central Gulf is really the first time that habitat's been formally identified within active oil and gas planning areas within the Gulf. And on the top left here on the slide, you can see the Western planning area and the Central planning area, which is still being leased actively for oil and gas. So previously, the core habitat area near the DeSoto Canyon, which was the focus of a lot of conservation, and management effort, it was the main focus for the whale. That area falls, at least primarily, within the Eastern planning area, which has a moratorium on oil and gas drilling in place until 2032. And because of the moratorium, the area hasn't been a recent hotbed of industry interest. But you can see here by the high density of active lease blocks in the Central and Western Gulf, and this is in the figure on the right, these areas are of interest to industry. And so Rice's whales have found themselves more recently directly in the crosshairs due to any potential required protections from the species that might impact, industry interests. And this has led this heightened industry interest has led to an unprecedented wave of congressional attacks on the whale, with political representatives attempting to misuse the law to block federal regulations to protect, primarily protect industry interests. And Christian is gonna share more on that in a few slides. So I'll tee up that conversation here. So what are we doing to help? So there's a growing community of NGOs and members of the Gulf community that are working as part of a closely coordinated coalition to protect and build support for the whale. One of the ways we're doing this is by engaging the science community. I'm biased, I'm a scientist, but arming ourselves with the best available science and communicating that to decision makers and the public by, authoritative voices does provide an important bedrock to all of our other advocacy efforts. For example, in November 2022, 100 scientists submitted an open letter to the Biden administration to convey their concerns that oil and gas development in the Gulf posed a clear and existential threat to Rice's whales. A year later, the Smithsonian hosted a scientific symposium about whales on the brink of extinction, with Rice's whales the prominent focus there. We're also digging deep on congressional defense, and I have the privilege to work with a tenacious and resilient group of whale lobbyists who are helping to build whale champions in Congress. They're also arming friendly Congress members with facts and science to help fight bad bills and amendments, and frankly harmful and erroneous rhetoric that we've been seeing quite a lot of that, including some representatives are likening Rice's whale to the Loch Ness monster and implying that they don't exist and they're a mythical creature, which is both amusing and horrifying at the same time when you watch these these types of conversations. Folks working in the lobby space are also having one-on-one meetings with officers to educate them about the whale and strategize and helping to communicate to them that the public really does care about whales, showing them that the people that they represent care and that they want them to make good protective decisions for this species. And we're also successfully growing a vibrant grassroots effort of public support for the whale. Christine is going to speak to this in more detail, but I just wanted to highlight the broad array of activities we've been engaged in. We now have a really cool logo shown in the top right here, and Christine and I have spoken, and we have some stickers available with this logo on. They're relatively small, but the perfect size for a water bottle. And I think in the follow-up to this webinar, Christine will offer to send those out to folks who are interested, who'd like to help spread the word about Rice's whales. We've also been spreading the word via blogs and webinars like this one and other public events. Some incredible collaborations have been developed with members of the arts community, including, I think, at least one individual who's listening in today, which is great, and also local businesses. And we've been making sure that Rice's whales are top of mind in the press. Several years ago, if I could just reflect briefly, when I first started working on this species, no one had really heard of Rice's whales or Bruder's whales as they were then known. And just over the past 2 or 3 years, hardly a week goes by without Rice's whales being mentioned in the press, and a really new cool art piece coming out, or someone saying something, and it's just been really remarkable to see how the word has spread, and now there's been such a there's a much greater understanding of this really special whale. So that's super exciting, and I'm excited to see where we're going to go next with that. So Christian, this might be a good time for me to hand it over to you if that works for you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Kershaw. That was it's fantastic to just see all the science that's being done, and reminder of what the main threats are, and then an unfortunate reminder of some of the rhetoric that's been going on around the whales that we're going to talk a little bit about. So Dr. Kershaw was nice enough to load in a few slides of mine to just kind of help tell the story of the experience that I'm having, and I think a lot of the rest of you are, who live here on the Gulf Coast around Rice's whales. So interestingly, as Dr. Kershaw mentioned, it was 2021 was the big announcement. The scientific paper was released, and it really hit the news in a major way, that we had this newly identified species in the Gulf. Now, of course, the bigger part of the story is that scientists have been working on this whale for many, many decades. That includes Healthy Gulf, as the work that we do, which I call science-based advocacy. We had been working on the then known as Brutus whales, now Rice's whales, for probably a dozen years or more. We've been involved in some litigation with our national partners like NRDC and others to get the species designated as an endangered species, and then also later on for the critical habitat designation that, as Dr. Kershaw mentioned, is going on right now and will be released in August. And every great environmental and social movement includes legal action as a tool in the toolbox. But one of the things that happened once the news hit and people started to become familiar with and answer this question that we have whales in the Gulf of Mexico. The answer is yes, we do. We started to get more reports of videos and photos. I started to do more outreach to fishermen, and they started to report these sightings. And I would try to work with local newspapers to get those published. So we saw some out of Texas, we saw some here around Pensacola, and that's a really key thing in the recovery of the Rice's whales is to document these sightings because the whales live so far offshore. Not many people go out there. It's very expensive to go out there and do research and surveys. So the more we can record and document these sightings and where those take place, it's really important for the scientific record, but it also creates a nice buzz around for the public and reminder that the whales are out there and just raising as much awareness as we can. So that's been a real positive thing that's been happening in recent years since the announcement in 2021. Next slide, please. So one of the things I was able to do as someone who's on the ground here on the Gulf Coast and working with fishermen and other folks in the community is working with a reporter from National Public Radio to get her and her sound engineer offshore out into the DeSoto Canyon from Pensacola. So we have a local fisherman who's a neurologist here in Pensacola. He's actually one that was in that former slide, who was nice enough to get photos and video that ended up being published in the Pensacola News Journal. And he was kind enough to offer to take us all offshore for the day. So it's quite a deal to go 60 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico. I had never been out there before. It takes some planning. You got to wait for the right window of weather. But it was an amazing opportunity. We watched for whales. We listened for whales. We didn't happen to see or hear any that day, but it provided a good backdrop for this national story that was being done on National Public Radio because she had talked to different scientists and researchers and people in the industry, but she had not gone offshore and not talked to fishermen. So it was an important part of that. And it was an amazing experience for me personally, because I've never seen water so blue in my life. And you realize when you go that far offshore, it's really like a biological desert. And the whales are actually contributing through something they call the whale pump, which we didn't talk about tonight, but basically the way they redistribute nutrients in the Gulf of Mexico to really help increase the productivity of those deep water areas of the Gulf. And without the whales there, or with the whales in such few numbers, the Gulf is really being robbed of that natural redistribution of nutrients that otherwise would be happening if the whales were there. Next slide, please. We're all familiar on the Gulf Coast here with a lot of other iconic endangered species. We've all learned to live with them. We love these animals. Things like brown pelicans were actually a success story because they've been able to be removed from the endangered species list. But things like Gulf sturgeon that swim from the Gulf up into our freshwater areas, into our rivers, manatees. I had the good fortune to see 3 manatees this morning on my walk along the beach in an area a couple hours east of Pensacola this morning. And then all the species of sea turtles. These are all animals that are protected under the Endangered Species Act. They're all animals that we see here on the Gulf Coast and familiar with, and we've learned to happily live with them, and we can do the same with the Rice's whales as well. So next slide, please. So one of the things that's happened, and Dr. Kershaw kind of mentioned it, but there's just been this buzz of excitement and just kind of this organic contribution of people like artists and musicians to the world of Rice's whales. Creative people are always looking for something new to add into as a subject. And so this is Andy Sosinski, who's an artist a couple hours east of Pensacola in the Santa Rosa Beach area, who read an article about Rice's whales a few years back and got permission from a local restaurant to do a mural there of the Rice's whales. And almost every week now, I hear something new going on like this. An artist has done a painting, or somebody has done some other kind of creative. Corey Diane is actually participating or joining us on our call this evening. Corey Diane's a musician in New Orleans who's done some amazing work combining the sounds of Rice's whales in the Gulf of Mexico with different musical scores, and they're working on continuing to make that contribution to the world as well. So artists, musicians are just picking up the cause of the Rice's whale and adding that into their work just organically without anybody prodding them. And that's an amazing contribution to all of this as well. Next slide. That includes, developing what I always call a whale culture. We don't have a whale culture here on the Gulf Coast, right? And that's why people say, we have whales here. Our whales are not typically seen from shore. Very few people see them, unlike, the Atlantic coast where you hear about right whales that come closer to shore. So we've got to develop that whale culture. And so we've got to kind of jumpstart that process. And so one of the things we were able to do this spring, back in April, with actually a little bit of seed money, thankfully, from the Natural Resources Defense Council, from NRDC, was we held the first ever Gulf Coast Whale Festival on Pensacola Beach at the end of April, and did some amazing, art and music and science around the whales. There was art, there was puppetry going on. We had some students at a local high school program actually created their own inflatable Rice's whale that you see there on the left, which was just a lot of fun. The little kiddos, the top right there, they did an oath to be good stewards of the Gulf of Mexico and to take care of the whales, and they took a little pledge for that, and it was just a lot of fun. We even had some kids that created their own little puppets at home, and they brought those out. It turned out to be a very windy day, so we couldn't put some of the other inflatable whales up, but everybody had a great time. So much fun that we want to continue to do that every year. So watch for that again next spring. But it's all about creating that whale culture here that we need help from all of you to help create as well. Next slide. So from some of the art and the science and the education from that, we've led to really action, and in that case, taking action to help protect and recover these whales. So NRDC has been very involved in this. Other groups like Earth Justice and certainly Healthy Gulf here on the Gulf Coast, communicating with our elected officials. I've done a lot of meetings with different port and shipping people and fishermen, and just trying to spread the word and trying to build support for action for the whales, because it's desperately needed. When you only have 50 or so of an animal remaining, they are literally teetering on the edge of extinction. So time is of the essence. We don't have a lot of time, so we've really picked up our action and gotten more aggressive with that. And unfortunately, so have the anti-whale forces as well. So next slide. It's just a listing of some of the things going on currently in Congress. I don't think prior to the year 2023, the United States Congress had ever even uttered the term Rice's whale. But once our organizations, Healthy Gulf and NRDC and some others, had proposed some initial conservation actions, namely vessel speed restrictions for the whales. After that, it really blew up into a lot of strong anti forces from some of the different elected officials at the national level. And so that's what you see reflected now. It's been in the news a little bit, a second year in a row, where Representative Gates has introduced a piece that it's actually in the funding bill for the House funding bill for the defense, national defense, that Eglin Air Force Base would not have to follow any. They would basically be exempt from any special protections for Rice's whales, even though the Air Force did not ask for that, and they have a long history of working with endangered species. So that's something we hope can be removed later in the negotiations between the Senate and the House side, because they'll pass different versions of that bill, and they've got to come to an agreement on that. So the folks that Francine mentioned doing the lobbying in DC, and people like all of you as well, will be pushing to help make that happen. There are a number of other things attached to, for example, the Department of Commerce, Justice, and Science appropriations bills, which basically would say the federal government cannot spend any money on enforcing vessel speed restrictions, or even the critical habitat that is, again, going to be released in August. That may happen, but if this passed, it would say you can't spend even a penny on anything to administer it or to move it forward. So, and there's a couple of standalone bills as well that we would very much consider anti-whale and would delay any protections at all for a number of years. So it's really important now that we all work to push back against this, because I think our elected officials have heard a lot from shipping industry and fishermen and other people on the Gulf Coast that think they might be impacted by this, and they haven't heard enough from the public and from conservation. So next slide. And that's where we actually have an action, and I'm going to drop it in the chat. Some of you that might be Healthy Gulf members, or you might already get our emails, you may have already seen this. It just went out the other day. We try to make it easy for you by packaging together kind of a sample letter that makes it very easy to send to your, in this case, your federal elected officials, your House of Representatives member, and also your 2 United States senator, regardless of which state you live in. You can also do those kinds of messages on your own through the members website as well. But this is really, really important. And I will send this out again, this action alert, later. I'm going to do a follow-up email tomorrow to everybody with a few follow-up items, including a reminder about this action alert. But this is part of how we engage all of you. We engage our members. It's really, really important to lend our voices to this. If you talk to the staff of members of Congress, and I get a chance to do that occasionally, both in person and remotely, and they absolutely say it does make a difference. They need to hear from people on the Gulf Coast, and we've had a hard time so far getting friendly members of Congress on the Gulf Coast, and so I think they just haven't heard enough from all of us yet. There is strong support for whales here. I know it when I go out to these events, when I get out in the community and talk to people. But so far, I think they've heard a little bit louder from some of the voices of like the shipping industry or port people that think they might be affected by this. The reality is, once you get into the details, the shipping industry worldwide is adapting to these sorts of vessel speed restrictions all over the world, and they can live with that, and they can ultimately do it on the Gulf Coast as well. But we do encourage you to take action. That action alert is dropped in there, and like I said, I'll send it around to everybody again tomorrow in our follow-up email. And I think that was all I had, Francine. Is that there? I think we're time for yeah,
That
yeah,
was it.
questions.
Yeah, we're at time. And
So
I'm just responding to one in the chat about birth to maturity time, which is 9 years. So I'm just going to pop that in there. And I'm going to put in a link to the NOAA website that has like basic biological information as well about that.
thank you for that. Yeah, the NOAA website so far is the best single source for all things rhesus whales. There is a site being set up. It's under development now by the conservation organization, so it'll have some different information on there, and we can let all of you know if you are Healthy Gulf members or sign up for emails, whatever. We will be sure to let you all know when that's up and running, and that'll be a good source of new information as well. So a couple of other questions we've gotten. One was about tagging the whales. Is that something, Dr. Kershaw, that can be done so that folks know, where they are, maybe so that ships could avoid them, or would better help, the researchers just better understand the population? Is it possible to tag these whales?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. So the answer is yes and no. So for some research purposes, you can tag them using tags that are like suction cups. They're just short duration. They kind of suck onto the skin and they'll last for, a few hours to days until, they fall off. And those tags are particularly good for tracking how deep the whale is diving, like its movements, and they can also listen out for whale sounds, so they can pick up like vocalizations that are really close to the whale that you might not be able to hear from, a recorder that's further out in the ocean and further away. That's particularly good for mom calf sounds, at least for some other species, because they tend to whisper to one another when they're talking to their young. So you need to be really close to them. The the question I often get asked, the context I often get asked this question though is like, can we tag whales so that we know where they are all the time, so we can, like avoid move around them, like maybe move our vessel around them and so on. And that's where it gets a little tricky, because even the longest duration tags will still only last at the most for several weeks, and that's if you get a really good deployment that the whale doesn't manage to kind of rub off on the seabed or something like that. And so you would constantly be needing to re-tag animals. And then from a health and safety perspective for the whale, those long duration tags need to embed like pretty deep into the skin and into the muscle. And so it can unfortunately create some health situations. There's been examples in other species of whale, including endangered whales, where those wounds have become infected, and it's kind of a live conversation in the animal welfare and science community as to whether we should be doing those long duration tagging on endangered species just for research efforts, let alone for kind of mitigation and monitoring. So for the short term, yes, we can do that, and that information's told us some really important things about the whale, such as its dive behavior and the information that it stays rests just beneath the surface at night, and so is really vulnerable to vessel strikes. That information came from tagging, short-term tags, but the longer term, long duration tags are just not possible logistically. They're also really expensive, and then just from a health and safety perspective from the whale, it's not really a viable option.
So Corey Diane dropped a question in the chat asking about any other information we might know about social behavior, reproductive behavior, sexual behavior, anything else that you want to add to that?
You know, I I think we know very little. So these whales are really elusive, and there's been very few sightings. I think, Christine, unless I've missed, I'm not even sure we have a picture of a mom and calf together. Like we know, we know that they are calving in the DeSoto Canyon area, but we have so few sightings, and those kind of behavioral studies require, focal follow. So you'll go out in a boat and you'll stay close to the whale and kind of follow it and see what it does. And for whales that far offshore, there's a lot of kind of cost implications for researching the whale. And so until a few years ago, we knew hardly anything. And then NOAA has done this amazing, 5-year study that I spoke about briefly. So now we know so much more. But a lot of that information has come from passive acoustics, where we can put a recorder out there and come back to shore and leave it be, and then we'll pick it up later and listen to everything that it's found. So what I'm hoping is that NOAA will get funding to continue to do like another, hopefully another 5 years of research, and we might be able to, use some maybe new technologies, maybe some unmanned drones, aerial systems, or something like that to help us collect more data. But I think everything that we do know is pretty much on that NOAA website. And as you say, Christian, will include some of that information and some other things on our forthcoming website. So I'll put that in the chat as well for folks to
Great.
use as a resource.
Excellent. So
Thanks for the question.
Question from Mackenzie. What are some everyday actions people can do to support the whales after they've already sent a message to their elected officials?
I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Christine, too, because we both work at the forefront of this. But I feel like just tell your friends that this whale exists, that it needs help, that you've called your congressperson and you've said these things, and please could you also call them and do the same. I feel like even though we've made a lot of strides on the education front, there's still so much more to do and more people to reach. And when industry kind of are reaching out to their representatives about their concerns, that they're scheduling meetings every day. It's really, we've seen some of the meeting lists for some of the offices recently and some of the other agencies, and different industry bodies like meeting with them every single day. And it's really hard for others in the community, NGO community, or others to be able to bring to bear that number of resources consistently, because we're always working with limited funds, and we do everything we can with very little. But I think what would really help is for more people to be calling, often, regularly, if they see anything concerning, in a news story or from our website, please call them again. Just keep calling them and get all of your friends to call them too.
Well, I would say something very similar to that, and I'm going to borrow a term that was used. I showed you in one of the photos from the Whale Festival when the kids came forward, and we had the publisher of the Pensacola Beach newspaper called Island Times, and she did the pledge. The kids, it was called to be whale wonderful, and the kids raised their right hand and they pledged to be good stewards of the ocean and to protect the whales. And one of the things that the kids pledged to do, and this is what Shelley Johnson came up with, was to be chatty. And what she meant was get out there and talk to your friends about the whales, talk to your family about the whales. So that's, and Dr. Kershaw just pretty much said that. Yeah, be chatty. We're not chatty enough about a lot of these, a lot of these issues. So tell your friends that the whales exist. Tell them how they can take action. I mean, it's just fun to talk about them anyway, because they're so fascinating. Their lives are so interesting. There's still so much mystery, right? So much to learn. And there's
That's
this
so
amazing,
cool.
yeah, I mean, it's just amazing
Yes.
story. This is a whale that lives only in the Gulf of Mexico, nowhere else in the world, and sadly is one of the rarest. So there's a lot to talk about there. So yeah, be chatty, be chatty. um, so continuing on, let's see if did I miss another other question. Sexual maturity. Did want to ask about that passive acoustic monitoring, just the usefulness of that as a tool for determining the distribution of these whales. I imagine it cuts down on a lot of the otherwise what would be a lot of time out on boats. It's very expensive and very labor intensive.
Yeah, exactly right. And, I think the power of that tool has really shown up in our now increased understanding of the Western and Central Gulf distribution. Like, there've been a lot of surveys. Well, no, sorry, there've been a few surveys in the area, vessel and vessel-based or aerial surveys, and there've been maybe one whale spotted in the across the whole decades. And was it really a Rice's whale? We're not sure. Um, but we put those hydrophones out there, and my goodness, suddenly they're lighting up. Oh, we hear them here. We hear them. Wow, we hear them all the way over here, and they're there year round. And we hear them on multiple days in a row. And without those types of tools, it would have been challenging, I think, for us to maybe have ever collected that kind of data and developed that understanding of the species, because it takes a long time to fly from shore to those offshore areas. It takes a long time to go out in a boat. Um, those are very expensive research expeditions. When you start getting offshore, you need kind of a whole different staffing system. And then even so, you can only go out, on fair weather days. You're looking out mainly during the day. It's only for a few days, a year. Whereas you can put those acoustic recorders out year round, and you have to go out and collect them every so often, but not really that frequently. And then I think then kind of the challenge is you have so much acoustic data that you have to sift through. But there are some pretty neat computer algorithms that do that and can auto detect whale vocalizations now, that a scientist can then go and kind of double check and make sure, yes, that was a whale. The other thing that passive acoustic recorders do is they pick up human generated sound. Um, and so the seismic blasting noise, we now have this whole new understanding about how frequently those are heard across the Gulf, how far away you can hear them. Wow, you can hear them across the entire Gulf basin, even if they're happening on the other side. And it gives you a much better understanding of kind of the habitat impacts from noise as well. And you can kind of pair that together with your understanding of vocalizations. Whales don't vocalize all the time though, so it's really important to still have those visual surveys in all of our, NRDC's recommendations on whale monitoring, in all kinds of different things that we work on. We always recommend pairing visual and acoustic together, because you don't see every whale and you don't hear every whale. And if you put them together, you still won't detect every whale, but you're going to, improve your likelihood of detection significantly by doing both together. So yeah, we need both, but those passive acoustic recorders have been so valuable in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly for Rice's whale. And they're now processing data for a whole bunch of different species. So I think we're going to learn a lot more about how neat the Gulf is for marine mammals and
Well,
fish too. Yeah.
I'm glad you talked about noise impacts, because I'll never forget reading the study with the right whales on the Atlantic side. And I believe it was maybe in the days after 9/11, if everybody will remember, all air traffic and shipping traffic stopped for some period of time. And I guess they regularly sample by taking samples of the whale's poop, right? When they defecate at the surface, they collect that. And they were able to determine that the stress hormones in the whales went down dramatically during those days when the ships were not running and the ocean was quiet again. And it was just a tremendous relief to the whales. That really drove home to me the importance of the noise issue. So.
Yeah, they're just like us. And, we're in loud environments for long periods of time. We get stressed out. We can't do the things we need to do. We're trying to talk to each other in a restaurant. It's loud. We're having to yell. They do the same thing. Sometimes they just give up because it's too loud. They don't talk and they don't communicate those important things that they need to do and say. And yeah, noise is a wide ranging problem for marine mammals and other marine life. There's a lot of science now showing that fish and invertebrates and even diving seabirds, they all need to be able to hear well underwater. Otherwise, when they're exposed to noise, they experience a wide array of different types of harm. So it's a kind of a marine ecosystem health issue beyond just whales.
Well, let's take the question from Mackenzie in the chat, and then after that, we'll wrap up real quick with I have a last question for you about critical habitat, and then we can break for the evening. But the question was about the evidence of the whales stopping their calls when there's significant human noise produced. do you see the question, Dr. Kershaw, or
Yes, yeah, I
if you're
do.
able to speak
So
to that?
yeah, so there's been evidence of whales stopping their calls when there's been significant human noise being produced. That's true of some species. I'm not sure that's been shown in rice whales yet, but in some other baleen species, yes, that's true. Would acoustic recordings aid in supporting that? Yes, there's going to be different. I'm trying to think of like the scientific study design for that. I think one thing that could be really helpful would be those tags that you can kind of suction onto the whale that can detect the vocalizations really close to them. Because if you're trying to figure out from an acoustic recorder quite far away and there's other loud noise happening, sometimes that loud noise might mask the vocalizations of the whale and if a whale is far away from that recorder, you might not be able to hear them quite as loud. So if you had one of those suction tags on that could, detect those vocalizations close to the whale, and then that tag had been on for some time, or you tagged across multiple days with those, seismic blasts and some days without, and then you could compare the calling rates between the two. Then I think that would be really valuable in showing, those kinds of direct impacts. Those same tags can be used to look at dive depths and like swim speed and direction. And so you could also see maybe if a whale is changing its dive behavior when it's exposed to noise at different distances, or is it, a lot of animals tend to kind of increase their swim speed and direction in a way that they're kind of panicking or not quite sure what to do. Um, Most of that information has come from fish in the past because it's really hard to do this kind of research on whales. You have to get enough whales to sample, and for Rice's whales, that's going to be really tricky to find them and then the tagging success rate. But that's how you would approach a question like that. You could also try to do it in other species of baleen whale where there's maybe a more likelihood that you will see whales and tag them. Those with a greater population size, and kind of see what behaviors they do, and then see if you could compare them with Rice's whales. Although that would also be in a different geography, so there's other complicating factors there. But I think there's a lot of utility that can come from those kind of suction tags, or D tags as they're called. You just have to be able to find the whale and then successfully tag them, and they only last a few hours, so you probably need to do that a few times. So your sampling ability is, probably the main limiting issue there. But it's doable, and there's been papers published on it for rice as well.
So just to wrap up, as I mentioned in my piece of that, kind of the most immediate thing going on is some of the attacks on the whales in Congress, but following closely after that is the critical habitat designation for the whales that will go final in August, and you showed the map of that. Can you talk a little bit more what exactly that's going to mean for the whales? What exactly does that mean for activities in the Gulf of Mexico to have that critical habitat designation?
Well, so having a critical habitat designation, and this is me talking as a scientist and not not a lawyer. I don't think it directly confers any specific management requirement in the moment, but it's used as a tool in all kinds of regulatory decision making that will be used in that area. And so it's implied, and then through the regulatory process, that federal agencies that are permitting industry activities like oil and gas or like offshore wind or so on need to account for the fact that ESA critical habitat exists in that area. And then, the expectation is that they would put in requirements to reduce impacts to the whale in the area and to protect the integrity of that habitat. So in its proposed form, it's not yet making its way into that regulatory decision-making process, but once it's final, it will do so, and it will need to be explicitly considered in all of those various actions.
And just a reminder that designation of critical habitat is really a result of legal action by NRDC, Healthy Gulf, and some other partners where, again, the recovery of endangered species critical habitat designation is a required part of that. The federal government was not doing it for the Rice's whales. And so several of our organizations sued. And when you get to court and you get free of the politics of it, the judge can look at the law, and they clearly ruled that the federal government needed to do that. So we're going to be on the lookout for that in August. It could very well be something that's going to be challenged by the oil and gas industry. We will see. But that's something where we need to continue to build everybody's support, and we'll be doing some actions around that in August to make sure that the federal government knows that the people of the Gulf Coast and really everywhere in the United States support this designation and support conservation for the whales. So, well, I think with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Dr. Kershaw, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for providing all your expertise. I learned something new every time. So thank you for being here tonight.
You're welcome. It's been a complete pleasure. And yeah, I apologize for the coughing earlier on. We managed to get through. Yeah, and just appreciate everyone spending time in there. You know, our lives are busy, and you spent your evening with us learning about this. So thank you so much.
Oh yes, yeah, and it's true. All of you who participated tonight, you're all leaders in the Rice's whale conservation movement simply by being here this evening and doing that. So remember to be chatty, right? Talk it up with your friends, and I will be sending out an email with some additional follow-up information, a link where you can sign up for occasional email updates from Healthy Gulf, so you can continue to stay informed about the issues with Rice's whales and really many other issues in the Gulf of Mexico. I'll also give you that link to the action alert again if you haven't already taken action, and then I'll remind you about getting your own Rice's whale sticker, and we can get one sent out to you. So. With that, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We'll get this video posted to YouTube shortly as well, so you can view it there as well and share it with your friends. And thank you all again, and you all have a wonderful evening.